Hi everyone. The Scottish Creel Fishermen's Federation in Scotland is the national trade association for small-scale artisanal creel, dive and line fishermen, and much of our work is around promoting and incentivising lower impact fisheries. And today I would like to talk about the case for spatial management in Scotland's inshore fisheries, which we believe is the mechanism by which we can achieve that end. So the Scottish Creel Fishermen's Federation is part of a wider coalition of small-scale fishermen throughout Europe. Low Impact Fisheries of Europe is one of Europe's largest fishing organisations with nearly 10,000 members. And again, we generally promote small-scale artisanal fishing and investigate mechanisms by which we can incentivise lower impact fisheries. So one of the issues we have in the small-scale fisheries sector is it's not a very well-defined thing. Fisheries are on a spectrum, and in the small-scale sector, there is no agreed definition, despite one of the Sustainable Development Goals saying we should incentivise and protect small-scale fishers. We don't define what that means. So there are many qualities that small-scale fishers have. They're usually under 12 metres. They usually fish within 12 miles of land. They're mostly owner-operated. They usually have a small crew between 1 and 3. They normally fish less than 24 hours. There are many other criteria. Those aren't fixed. Generally speaking, the only accurate definition we can find in legislation is in the European Maritime and Fisheries Fund, which states that small-scale fishers are vessels under 12 metres using non-towed gear. But again, that's a terrible definition. So despite not being able to define it particularly well, we try and advocate for this subsect of the fleet. Now we're going to focus particularly on Scotland. In Scotland, we don't use spatial management. There are places that do. England has spatial management for some of its fisheries. Norway is a great example as a 12-mile limit and practically the use of all towed gear. In Scotland, we have no restrictions, or very, very few, on using towed gear. We can tow scallop dredges and Nephrops trawls right up to the coast in Scotland with practically any size of vessel. And that we find is quite problematic for this subsect of the sector we represent. So the small-scale fleet, one of the reasons why it's so important is that we have disproportionate value, whether it's socially, economically, or environmentally. In Scotland, the under 10-metre fleet is roughly 5% of landings by weight, 10% of landings by value, and we support nearly 2/3 of all jobs. And that's true across much of the UK and across much of the world. And this is one of the reasons why it's so important to support the small-scale fleet. So the other thing that's not particularly well defined is the definition between low impact and high impact. So it's part of the Fisheries Act to incentivise lower impact gear. But again, this is a very ill-defined concept. So again, it's a spectrum, and it's got much to do with the gear and the management of that gear. But for example, high impact gears might be large-scale dredges or trawls. Those gears use extensive areas of seabed, can disturb extensive areas of seabed. They often produce low-value bulk catches, and often the gear is very unselective on the target species. The inverse of that, in Scotland at least, is our creel fisheries, which, for anyone that doesn't know, is our word for pot and trap fisheries. We don't really have much netting in Scotland, but our principal method of static gear in the inshore is creels. They, generally speaking, have different economic and social outcomes from the large-scale industrial fisheries. They're high employment, highly selective, disturb very low areas of the seabed, and they're often a high-value catch. So one of the issues with not regulating or having spatial management in Scotland is this issue that you can fish up to the shore with large-scale mobile gears. One of the reasons this is problematic is that it leaves very little area for static gears. The two gears are mutually exclusive in their use in any given space and any given time. So it wasn't always the case in Scotland. We once upon a time had something called the 3-mile limit, which prohibited trawls within 3 miles of land, and also more extensively in our inland seas. So the areas in grey in this map is where trawling would have been restricted around shore. Now, unfortunately for us, after the declines in the whitefish stocks in the 1960s, the government, in its profound wisdom, decided to open up the inland seas to trawling. And then when those declines weren't stemmed in the middle of the 1980s, they decided to open up the remainder of the 3-mile limit. And I think when we look at the consequences of doing this, we get an idea of why spatial management is so important. So I'm going to give you a quick case study here. The Firth of Clyde. You can see on the map here, the outer area was the area that was opened up in the 1960s, and then the area delineated in the red line was the area that was opened up in the 1980s. And we can kind of map the consequences of doing that when we look at fish landings from the Clyde over that period of time. So the graph shows fish landings between 1960 and 2010. It's a 50-year snapshot of landings into the Clyde. And as you can see, we initially had this boom and bust type fishery. And then from the mid-1970s onwards, fisheries landings went into terminal decline. By the early 2000s, fish landings from the Firth of Clyde had declined by over 98%. And this is illustrative of arguably the whole wider inshore in Scotland. So another wee snapshot of the Firth of Clyde is our vessel monitoring pings. So if we aggregate all the vessel monitoring pings together, you get a map a little bit like this. Now in Scotland, we only track our over 12-metre trawlers. We don't track the small boats. And so, but what I'm trying to do here is give you an idea of the spatial footprint in the Firth of Clyde, how extensive the trawl footprint is. And there's two implications here. One is environmentally, and the other one is obviously for the small-scale fleet, who, as I said before, is just going to mutually exclusive use of this space. So in Europe and in the UK Fisheries Act since Brexit, we have a legal obligation to incentivise lower impact fisheries. And I have seen very few propositions to exactly how we do that. My proposition is the way to do that is to invoke spatial management. So it's not just in domestic legislation and European legislation. Part of our SDGs, our Sustainable Development Goals, is to provide access to fishing opportunity for small-scale and artisanal fishers. And again, I would argue we're not doing a very good job of that, certainly in Scotland at the moment. So one of the questions is, well, why? Why should we be incentivising small-scale fishers and protecting them? And there's several reasons, social, economic, and environmental. One of those is that generally speaking, this is a sweeping generalisation, this image, but generally speaking, small-scale fishers produce the vast majority of the jobs for the smallest percentage of the catch. We generally produce more revenue for any given kilos of fish that are caught, and we generally speaking have a smaller environmental footprint. So just a quick illustration of this is that in Scotland, if we look at the principal methods of catching scallops and nephrops, which are two of our main landings from the inshore, what we've got here is an illustration of the amount of seabed disturbance that's associated with employing two fishers in either of these fisheries. And as you can see, when you use mobile gears, the amount of seabed disturbance that's associated with these fisheries is several orders of magnitude more for mobile gears. And this is obviously very important because we have our Sustainable Development Goals, one of which I want to focus on here, which is the benthic habitats indicator, or the extent of seabed disturbance. Now, we have an agreement for our SDG that to qualify for good environmental status from the seabed, no more than 15% of our seabed should be considered highly disturbed. The OSPAR assessment currently has it at roughly 58%. So again, if we want to meet our environmental obligations, we've got to do a lot. Now, the government might say 37% of our seas are protected by marine protected areas, but within those marine protected areas, we're only restricting bottom tow gear in between 5 and 7%. So it's arguable that it's a very disingenuous claim that's being made by our governments. And again, I would just point out that we have a legal obligation to do this, and we are not doing this. I would argue it's quite clear that we have to use spatial management to incentivise lower impact fisheries. And I'm going to give you two quick examples of where we are doing that and how this works. We have Lyme Bay in England, where we closed an extensive area to trawl and dredge. It's producing excellent social, economic, and environmental outcomes. And the area that I work in the inner sound of Skye is an area that has an extensive trawl and dredge closure. The government have done some studies. We support more vessels in that area than almost anywhere else in Scotland. We support more fishing jobs in that area than almost anywhere else in Scotland. And we produce more revenue in that area than almost anywhere else in Scotland. And I would argue that shows that it's quite clear that spatial management is the principal mechanism that we could use to invoke better social, economic, and environmental outcomes and to incentivise lower impact fishing. Now, I think we really have to ask ourselves, what do we want? And I think we've asked ourselves that. We've made our Sustainable Development Goals. We've made our Fisheries Act. And so now we have to ask ourselves, well, how do we get what we want? And I would argue that there is no better mechanism than spatial management. And spatial management clearly produces more jobs, produces more revenues, and can lead to significantly less seabed disturbance and bycatch and discarding from our fishing industry. And we think it's really quite simple that large-scale and high-impact fisheries should not be directly competing or being allowed to displace small-scale fishers that offer superior social, economic, and environmental outcomes. The Fisheries Act obliges us to do this, and arguably through our fisheries management plans, if we adopt ecosystem-based approach to fisheries management, we would come to the conclusion that this is the way to do it. And really, the alternative is quite stark. If we don't do this, we are guaranteeing that we're going to get less jobs, less revenues, and poorer environmental outcomes. So we think the case is quite simple. It's just really about putting the right gear in the right place at the right time.